Rain came down hard over the Chicago docks, the night a homeless woman, named Maeve Sullivan, learned exactly how invisible a person could become. She was face down on the wet concrete of an alley behind the shipping yards, her cheek pressed to a puddle that smelled of oil and cold iron, dark bruises spreading across her arms and ribs beneath a thin coat that had once belonged to a woman with a job, an apartment, and a name people trusted. She'd been a nurse once, the kind who stayed past the end of every shift because someone always needed one more set of steady hands. Now she couldn't even lift herself off the ground. She tried to stand, because standing back up was the one thing she'd always known how to do, ever since the hospital in Cleveland took her license, her reputation, and the last shred of the life she'd built on a lie somebody else had told about her. Her legs buckled. She sank back down into the cold. That was when the black car eased to a stop at the mouth of the alley, and a man stepped out into the rain without hurrying, the way only men who are never afraid of anything move. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, dark hair going silver at the temples too early, for a man barely past 30, a faded scar running along the left edge of his jaw, like a sentence someone had tried to cross out. On his wrist he wore a small woman's watch that didn't belong there, and he never took it off. His name was August Reeves, and everyone along these docks knew that name the way you know the sound of a door locking behind you. He ran this stretch of the waterfront, and he ran it by one rule that had cost him more than anyone understood. No one strong ever got to hurt anyone weak inside his territory. He crouched down beside her, slipped his own coat over her shaking shoulders, and reached out his hand. He looked at her the way no one had looked at her in months, not as a problem to be managed at the lowest possible cost, but as a human being who'd been wronged. "Nobody's ever going to hurt you again," he said quietly, lifting her to her feet. "Not while you're in my part of this city." What neither of them knew yet was that the same buried secret had already ruined both their lives. That the sickness creeping through this waterfront was tied to the very pill that had once taken the little sister whose watch still ticked on his wrist, and that this broken woman in the rain was about to become the one person capable of dragging the whole rotten thing into the light. Before we go on, if a story about dignity, second chances, and the courage to stand back up speaks to you, please take a second to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. Your support means the world and keeps these stories alive. Now let's head back to that rain-soaked alley and find out what happens when a man who trusts no one reaches out his hand to a woman who stopped believing anyone ever would. His outstretched hand remained there, patient in the rain, but Maeve did not take it right away. Something inside her had learned not to trust hands offered too easily, because every kind hand she had ever held in life had turned out to carry a price, and the price was always higher than she had expected. She planted one elbow against the cold concrete and tried to lift herself up, because that was the only thing she had left, the last thing no one had managed to take from her, the ability to rise on her own even when her body was falling apart. Her whole life had been like that. From the years when she was little, when her father left and her mother worked 3 shifts a day to pay the rent, to the endless long nights in the emergency room, when she was the only one still awake among the beeping machines, to the morning they called her into a room and read aloud the sentence that had already been written for her. She had always gotten herself back up. But this time her legs betrayed her. They buckled again, and she had to grit her teeth to keep from crying out when her bruised ribs struck the edge of the metal trash bin. The man did not withdraw his hand, nor did he come any closer, did not bend down and haul her up with the strength he clearly had more than enough of. He only stood, letting the rain run along the brim of his hat, giving her time to look at him clearly, as though he understood that for a woman who had been thrown to the ground, the most frightening thing was not falling, but having a stranger decide what she must do next. Maeve said, her voice hoarse from the cold and from having gone too long, without saying anything to anyone longer than an apology, "I'm not getting into a car with a man I don't know. It doesn't matter who you are. I'm not going anywhere." August nodded slowly, as though that answer pleased him rather than offended him. He told her she was right, that she didn't know him, and that a wise woman did not climb into a stranger's car in a dark alley. He still did not move. Rain tapped against the shoulders of his coat in dark streaks, and Maeve realized he was prepared to stand there all night if he had to, not to force her, but to prove something that words could not prove. She had met many men who used patience as a weapon, and she knew how to tell the difference. Delaney had been patient in the way of a hunter, sitting still and waiting for his prey to weaken. This man's patience was different. It did not carry the scent of waiting in order to possess. It was more like the way someone kept watch beside a hospital bed, asking for nothing except to be there. He went on, in a voice as even as if he were discussing the weather, rather than trying to persuade a battered woman in the rain, saying there was a diner 3 blocks away, that the owner's name was Roz, that she would give Maeve a dry place, a bowl of something hot, and a door she could walk out of herself whenever she wanted, and that he would not go in with her if she did not want him to. He would only drive her there. Maeve looked at him. She had lived long enough on the streets over the past few months to know that every offer came with an invisible string attached, and she had learned that the most expensive thing in the world was not food or a place to sleep, but owing someone. But she also knew something else, something her body was screaming more clearly than any warning in her mind, that if she stayed in this alley through the night, with ribs that might be broken, and a cold already crawling deep into her bones, then perhaps she would not be able to get up in the morning, and that time it would not be because she did not want to. She had seen it happen to other people. She had once been the one lifting bodies like that onto stretchers, reading the time of death in the calm voice her profession had taught her, and she did not want to become a line on some other exhausted nurse's paper. At last she said she would get into the car, and she wanted him to understand the reason, wanted to keep some small thing that still belonged to her inside that decision. She said it wasn't because she trusted him, but because her legs could no longer hold her up. That was all. August answered that all was enough. He did not smile, did not look triumphant, only offered his hand again, and this time when she took it, she noticed that his hand was strangely warm in the cold rain, and that there were calluses there, traces of some kind of labor a powerful man like him should never have had to do. He pulled her up slowly and steadily, adjusting his strength to the faint hiss she tried to swallow when her ribs stretched. He did not pretend he had not heard it. He said, "Not as a question, your ribs." She answered that maybe, that she hadn't had an X-ray. He looked at her for a moment, and there was something in that gaze that confused her. Not the pity she had already prepared herself to reject, but a quiet recognition, as though he were looking at someone of his own kind who had passed through the same kind of hell by a different road. The small woman's watch on his wrist lightly touched her hand as he helped her toward the car, and she did not understand why a man like that would wear it. But she was wise enough not to ask. There were wounds people wore on their wrists instead of hiding in their chests, and she understood that those wounds were often the ones that hurt the most. She let him help her walk, step by step through the rain, and inside her head, a familiar voice whispered that she was making a mistake, that she had always gotten up by herself, that leaning on someone was how people began to break. But tonight, for the first time in a very long while, she let that voice fall silent and simply kept walking. Roz's diner crowded on a street corner where the harbor lights had begun to thin, a low-slung building with a sign so faded that only half the letters could still be read, and the steam-fogged window spilled out the warm yellow light Maeve had forgotten she had once longed for so badly. When August pushed open the door, a small bell above the frame rang, and the smell of food rushed over her face like a memory from another life. The smell of fried onions, toasted bread, coffee left all night on the burner. A woman stood behind the counter, somewhere past 50, solidly built, her salt and pepper hair tied neatly at the back of her neck, her hands wiping a glass with the motion of someone who had repeated it 10,000 times. She looked up at them, her eyes passing over August for 1 second before lingering on Maeve, on the bruise across her cheekbone, on the way she stood tilted to protect her ribs, and in that look there was no curiosity or pity, only the quick and practical assessment of someone who had seen far too many broken bodies come through this door. Again, Reeves, Roz said, setting the glass down. "You keep dragging people out of alleys and bringing them here. I'm going to have to start charging you for bed space." "You've never charged me a dime," August answered, and there was an old familiarity in the way they spoke to each other, the kind belonging to people who had stood on the same side of the line long enough that politeness was no longer necessary. "Her ribs are hurt. I'm leaving her with you." Then he turned to Maeve, and what he did next, surprised her more than anything else that had happened tonight. He did not give instructions, did not impose himself, did not leave a business card or a reminder that she owed anyone. He only said, "Roz is the kindest person in this neighborhood. You're safe here," then gave one nod and stepped back out into the rain, letting the door close behind him with the sound of the little bell, leaving Maeve standing there with a strange woman in a warm room, not knowing what to do with the freedom she had just been given. Roz said nothing more about August. She came around the counter, pulled out a chair, and motioned Maeve toward it with a blunt lift of her chin. "Take off your coat. Let me look." Maeve hesitated, and Roz saw that hesitation, understood it the way someone understands who has once had to be wary of other people's offered hands. "I'm not going to do anything to you," she said, her voice softening slightly. "I've been bandaging up harbor workers for 30 years. Drunk men, men who fight, men who fall off cranes. Your ribs don't scare me." Maeve removed the wet coat, and when Roz lifted her shirt to look at the bruise spreading under her skin like a storm cloud, the woman only gave a low whistle and began working, pressing gently along each rib with fingers that were unexpectedly skillful. Maeve gritted her teeth and endured it, and inside her mind, the old part of herself, the nurse who had not quite died, automatically noted that Roz was doing it correctly, that no bone seemed fully broken, only cracked, that the way she wrapped the strip of cotton around Maeve's torso was the technique of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. But Maeve did not say that aloud. She had learned that what she once knew, what she once had been, was now only dangerous baggage, a door that, if opened even slightly, would make people ask why a nurse was lying bruised in an alley. And the answer to that question was something she could not bear to speak into words. So she stayed quiet, letting Roz think she was only another miserable woman who had drifted into the harbor, and that was far easier than the truth. When the bandaging was done, Roz set a steaming bowl of soup in front of her, potatoes and meat stewed until tender in a dark broth, along with a thick slice of bread. Maeve looked at it, and her stomach clenched with hunger, but something else inside her was stronger than hunger. "I don't have money to pay," she said, "and I don't take charity." Roz stopped, turned back to look at her, and for the first time that night, something almost like a smile passed across the corner of the woman's mouth. Not the pity Maeve had already built walls against, but a recognition, as though she had just found what she had been looking for in this woman. "I never give anything to anybody for free," Roz answered flatly. "That's not how I run this place." Maeve held her gaze. "Then let me work. Anything. Wash dishes, mop floors, clean the storeroom. I don't need kindness. I need a job and a dry place to lie down until I can stand steady again." There was a silence, and in that silence Roz assessed her once more, this time longer, more carefully, and Maeve bore that look without lowering her eyes, because she knew this was the kind of moment that decided everything. The moment when a stranger decided whether she was a burden or a human being. "There's a small room upstairs," Roz said at last, turning back to wipe the counter as though she had just settled an order of supplies. "Used to be my daughter's. She got married and moved out. The bed is hard, the window looks out over the garbage lot, and in the morning I need someone to help set up at 5 o'clock. You can do that, the room is yours. Eat, it's a waste if the soup gets cold," and Maeve picked up the spoon, her hand still trembling, no longer from the cold but from an emotion she did not dare name, and she ate one spoonful at a time. Slowly, telling herself the thing that had kept her alive through the past few months, that she did not have to understand what tomorrow would be, did not have to trust anyone, only had to do the next thing in front of her. And the next thing right now was to finish the bowl of soup and sleep one night beneath a roof. And she could do that. She could always do the next thing. On her third morning at Roz's diner, Maeve was up before dawn, sweeping the front yard and rearranging the newly delivered crates, working in the gray stillness of the harbor at daybreak while the tugboats were still asleep and the water lay flat as a sheet of metal. Her ribs still hurt every time she bent down, but she was used to working through pain. That was what nursing had taught her in the early years, that the body could go on doing what needed to be done even while it protested, and she let the pain become background noise rather than a reason to stop. It was while she was pulling a crate of tomatoes into the corner of the storeroom that she saw it, a leather wallet lying under the farthest table, probably slipped from someone's pocket the night before when the diner was still crowded. She picked it up, and even before she opened it, she felt its weight, the weight of something holding more money than she had touched in nearly a year. She opened it because she needed to know whose it was, and inside was a thick stack of cash, new bills still crisp and straight, along with a card bearing the name of a man named Ruiz, and Maeve recognized that name, one of the quiet men who had sat in the corner of the diner the night before with August, one of the men Roz served without needing to ask what they wanted. She stood there for a very long time in the dim light of the storeroom, the wallet open in her hand, and she would not pretend to herself that the thought did not pass through her mind. This money could get her out of here, could buy her a bus ticket to another city where no one knew her name, could become a thin cushion between her and the abyss whose edge she had been standing on for months. No one had seen her pick it up. No one knew it was here. That man surely had more money than this, would hardly miss it. And the world had taken so much from her that perhaps the universe owed her a little repayment. She allowed that thought to live for a full minute, did not suppress it, did not pretend she was nobler than she really was, because she had learned that lying to oneself was the first step toward losing oneself. Then she closed the wallet. She did it not because she was afraid of being caught, nor because some moral lecture echoed in her head, but for a simpler and deeper reason, that the only thing they had not been able to take from her in Cleveland, the thing they had deliberately stained but never truly touched, was the way she could look into a mirror and know who she was. They had called her a liar, negligent, the one who had let a patient die. They had pasted every label on her that a lie could create. But inside, in the place no one could reach, she knew the truth, and that truth was her last possession. And she would not trade it for a stack of cash from a man who had dropped his wallet in a late-night diner. She carried the wallet outside, and when Roz had just opened the door for the morning shift, Maeve set it on the counter in front of her. "This belongs to someone named Ruiz," she said. "He left it here last night. Everything is still inside. Please keep it and return it to him." Roz looked at the wallet, then at Maeve, then picked it up and flipped it open with her thumb, counting the stack of money quickly with the eyes of someone who knew exactly how much was in there. She said nothing for a while, only looked at Maeve with an expression that was hard to read, and Maeve suddenly felt the need to explain, to make the act smaller than it really was, because she was used to shrinking herself, used to not letting anyone see what she had been forced to weigh. "It isn't a big deal," she said. "It wasn't mine. That's all." "Your flat broke," Roz said, not as a question. "That's right, and you still brought it back." Maeve shrugged, and the shrug sent a sting through her ribs. "Some things cost more than money," she answered, then turned away to keep unpacking supplies, not wanting to stretch the moment any longer, not wanting to be looked at anymore. What she did not know was that later that afternoon, when Ruiz came back looking for the wallet with the tense face of a man about to have to explain missing money, Roz returned it to him intact and told him who had found it and what she had done. And what she knew even less was that the story, that small detail that seemed hardly worth mentioning, traveled its own road through quiet conversations in the corner of the diner until it reached Reeves late that night. He listened without saying anything, the way he always listened, letting the silence last long enough for people to say everything that needed saying. But inside his mind something shifted. He had saved many people from dark alleys. He had given many desperate souls a bowl of soup and a roof, and he had grown used to seeing them take whatever they could take and disappear into the night. And he did not blame them for that, because he understood what hunger did to people. But this woman, the one he had lifted from the rainwater, the one with nothing in her pocket and no one in the world, had held enough money in her hand to change her fate and had given it back. And August Reeves, who had spent his whole life in a world where everything had a price and everyone could be bought, sat for a long time in the darkness of his room that night, thinking about a woman whose name he did not yet truly know, and wondering who she was that she could still keep something most people in this harbor had sold long ago. It happened on a weekend evening when the diner was packed, and the air was thick with the smell of beer and the hoarse laughter of men just off shift, and Maeve was carrying a stack of dirty plates toward the kitchen when she heard glass shatter and a strangled curse from the corner of the room. She turned her head and saw one of August's men, not the younger man she had heard Roz call Tobias a few times, but an older one named Merrick, clutching his forearm tightly, and between his fingers blood was seeping in a dark, steady stream, running down and dripping onto the wooden floor. A beer bottle had broken on the table, and a blade of glass had opened a long line through his flesh, while the men around him stood up in a commotion with the peculiar helplessness of people who were very good at causing wounds and knew nothing at all about healing them. Maeve looked at that blood, and something inside her, something she had tried to bury deep for months, woke up automatically before her mind could even give the order. She set the stack of plates on the nearest table and crossed the room, and when her voice rose, it had changed. It carried the calm, commanding tone she had once used in the emergency room, the voice that told people what to do and left no room for argument. Sit down. Raise your arm above your heart. Don't squeeze the cut itself. Squeeze above it, right here. Merrick stared at her in confusion but obeyed, subdued by the quiet authority in her voice, and Maeve grabbed a stack of clean napkins from the counter, folded them into a thick pad, and pressed them over the wound with steady, firm pressure. "Someone get me clean water and whatever clean cloth is left," she said without turning around, and Roz was already there. Bringing a bowl of warm water and the roll of bandage she kept under the counter, and for a moment the two women worked side by side with the wordless coordination of people who knew what they were doing. But when Maeve lifted away the napkins to see the cut clearly, to judge its depth, and whether the glass had reached any important blood vessel, that was when her hands began to tremble. Not because she was afraid of blood. She had seen far more blood than this, enough that it no longer shook her. Her hands trembled because the last time she had done exactly this, the last time she had held a bleeding life in her hands and known everything depended on doing it right, had been the night everything collapsed, the night that became the first brick in the wall of lies people built around her. The memory came back uninvited, the smell of antiseptic, the sound of the heart monitor, the face of the older woman she had tried to save with everything she had, and her hands shook so badly that she had to clench them for 1 second, draw a deep breath, and force them to obey. She could do it. She could always do the next thing. She cleaned the wound, brought the two edges of skin close together, wrapped the bandage properly to stop the bleeding without cutting off circulation, and tied the knot neatly. And when she was done, Merrick looked at his bandaged arm, then at her with a new respect. "Are you a doctor?" he asked. "No," Maeve answered quickly, too quickly, and she stood to gather the blood-stained napkins, trying to look normal, trying to make the moment smaller. "People just learn how to bandage a few cuts growing up, that's all." It was a clumsy lie and she knew it, but she could do nothing else. She couldn't let that door open even a crack. She did not realize August had been standing there for some time, leaning against the frame of the doorway that led to the back, watching everything with his usual stillness. And when the crowd had scattered and Merrick had been taken home, he stepped forward, stopping at a distance just far enough not to make her feel trapped. "You didn't do that like someone who only knows how to bandage a few cuts," he said quietly. Maeve did not look up. "I told you. It wasn't anything." August was silent for a while, and that silence lasted long enough for Maeve to feel its weight, and at last when he spoke, there was no threat in his voice, only a directness that chilled her more than any threat could have. "I know you used to be a nurse, Maeve. In Cleveland. I know what happened, at least the version written in the papers." She stood frozen, the blood-stained napkins still in her hands, and the whole room seemed to shrink around her. "That first night I brought you here," he continued, evenly, as though stating an obvious fact, "I had someone find out who you were. I do that with everyone I bring into this neighborhood, not because I suspected you. Because in my work, not knowing who someone is can make other people pay the price." Maeve felt blood rush to her face, a mixture of fear and anger and that terrible familiar feeling of being exposed, stripped bare, turned into a file in someone else's hands all over again. "So what do you want?" she asked, her voice hardening. "You know who I am now. You know what people say about me. So is this where you tell me the price for being allowed to stay here? Everything has a price, doesn't it?" August looked at her, and in his eyes there was none of the contempt she had prepared herself to receive, nor any pity, but something she could not read, something that made her even more confused and wary. "No," he said slowly. "I don't want anything. I just thought you should know that I know. Because I don't like building anything on a foundation of secrets kept from each other." Then he turned away, leaving her standing there with her heart pounding, and one question turning over and over in her mind. What kind of game a man like that was playing if he knew everything about her and still demanded nothing? In the days that followed, Maeve learned that the harbor had a story of its own, and like every story in small places, it pieced itself together around her through scattered fragments. An unfinished sentence at the counter, a furrowed brow when someone mentioned a name, silences that said more than words ever could. She heard that name for the first time from a man named Gil, the owner of a small boat repair shop who had sat in the corner of the diner every morning for 20 years. When he told his friend in a low and weary voice that Halloran had sent another letter, and this time the offer was even lower than the last. Maeve, who was wiping a nearby table, kept the rhythm of her hands unchanged, but her ears had already sharpened, the old habit of someone who had once had to overhear hurried exchanges between doctors in the hallway, in order to piece together the picture of a patient no one bothered to explain to her fully. And so, piece by piece, she assembled the name Halloran into a shape. He was the head of a corporation, the kind of word people here pronounced with wariness, as though the word itself had teeth, a pharmaceutical and real estate conglomerate based somewhere far away in the city's glass towers. And for the past several years, he had been quietly buying up lot after lot along the harbor. There were voluntary sales, and then there were salespeople lowered their voices to talk about. Families that had held on for generations suddenly selling cheap and moving away in silence. Shop owners suddenly finding trouble with their permits. Loans abruptly being tightened. Small risks piling one on top of another until staying became harder than leaving. No one could prove anything, and that was exactly what made it frightening. Because Halloran didn't break the law, he bent it, and he did it with the patience of a man who had enough time and money to wait until everyone else was exhausted. Gil called it being worn down to death, the way Halloran made people tired before he made them bankrupt, and Maeve heard that sentence and felt something cold run along her spine, because she knew exactly what that felt like. She had once been worn down in precisely that way. Every whisper, every look, every piece of paper appearing at just the right moment had scraped away at her, until she no longer had the strength to fight the lie built around her. She recognized that weapon because it had once been used to kill the woman she used to be. And she gradually began to understand August's place in this picture, began to understand why people spoke his name in a way that was both fearful and almost grateful. Because August Reeves was the last man who had not sold. The stretch of waterfront he controlled was the only piece of land Halloran had not yet reached, and not from lack of trying. Maeve heard that there had been offers, then threats disguised as offers, then things that happened at night that no one clearly described. But August had remained standing there, between Halloran and the people he had quietly protected, the small shop owners and dock workers, and people like Maeve herself, people this city had decided were not worth its concern. She began to look at him differently, not with the pure wariness of before, but with a more complicated curiosity. Because a man who ruled an underworld through violence should have been exactly the kind of man who would sell this land for the highest price and walk away, and the fact that he did not raise a question she did not yet know how to answer. One evening, when she brought coffee to him, and the men sitting in their usual corner, she heard August say in a low, even voice that Halloran wasn't in a hurry, that he had never been in a hurry, and that was the most dangerous thing about him. One of the men replied with something about Pier 7, about a contract, about new papers that had appeared, and August only listened with the flat expression. Maeve was beginning to learn how to read, the flatness that was not indifference but restraint, the mask of a man who had decided not to reveal what he was thinking. She set the cup of coffee down and stepped back, but inside her head, the old part of herself that had not fully died began to work, remembering names, fragments of information, connections, arranging them the way she had once arranged a patient's symptoms in order to find the hidden illness beneath. Pier 7, Halloran, papers appearing at just the right time. She did not yet know what shape these pieces formed when joined together, but she knew one thing, that wherever there was a force making people sick and tired in such a systematic way, there was always a real disease buried deep underneath, waiting to be diagnosed. And whether she wanted to or not, she had begun to smell it. It began, as most important things in Maeve's life did, not with some grand decision, but with one simple next thing. After the night she bandaged Merrick, word of it spread in its own quiet way through a small place, and people began coming to her. First came an older woman, who lived in the rusted camper at the end of the lot. Arriving with a hand swollen from an infection she had tried to ignore until ignoring it was no longer possible. Then a dock worker with a back ruined by years of carrying too much weight. Then a young man with a stubborn cough that would not leave him. They came to her not because she invited them, but because in this harbor they had nowhere else to go, because the hospital demanded in papers and money, and things invisible people like them did not have, and she was the only one who looked at them without looking through them. At first she worked in the back kitchen of Roz's diner during the slow hours, but before long the number of people coming had grown so large that she needed a space of her own, and it was Roz who mentioned the warehouse. There was an old abandoned warehouse at the edge of the pier, a low brick building once used to store fishing nets, now holding only dust and empty shelves, and Maeve cleaned it with her own hands in the afternoons after her shift, sweeping away cobwebs, setting up an old table, arranging on it the few things she had managed to gather: bandages, rubbing alcohol, a few basic medicines bought with the meager wages Roz paid her, and an old lamp that cast a warm yellow light through the dim space. And there, in that dusty warehouse smelling of sea salt and old brick, Maeve found again something she had believed she had lost forever in Cleveland, the feeling of being herself. Not the battered woman in the alley, not the accused name in a file, not the shrinking shadow who apologized for her own existence, but Maeve Sullivan. The woman whose hands knew how to heal, the woman who could step into a room full of pain and know exactly what had to be done. Her hands still trembled whenever she held a needle, the tremor she had carried with her from that fateful night. But here, among people who knew nothing of her past and only needed her help, she felt that shaking soften little by little, like an old wound, finally beginning to grow new skin. Roz never said a word about it, but Maeve noticed that her dinner portions began to grow fuller, that her soup now had more meat in it, that there was always one extra slice of bread she had not asked for, and she understood that this was the woman's way of showing approval, not through praise but through plates of food, because Roz was the kind of person who believed caring for someone was more practical than talking about caring for them. As for August, Maeve barely saw him in those days. He came and went according to the private rhythms of his own world. But one morning, when she arrived early at the warehouse to prepare, she saw that something had changed. The roof, which had leaked so badly in the eastern corner that she had been forced to place a bucket there whenever it rained and move the examination table away from the damp spot, had been repaired. The broken tiles had been replaced, the gap had been sealed, and now when the rain fell, the warehouse remained dry and warm. No note had been left behind. No one told her who had done it. But she knew in the way people know the things that do not need to be spoken aloud, that August had sent someone to fix it, that at some point, when he had stopped by without her noticing, he had seen that leaking corner, and that he had quietly repaired it and walked away without demanding a thank you or even recognition. And standing there in the dry warehouse beneath the yellow glow of the old lamp, Maeve felt something tighten in her chest, a feeling she did not completely trust, because she had learned that kindness was often the softest trap. But this kindness was different. It did not demand her gratitude, did not need her to see it, did not bind her to a debt. It had simply repaired a roof so she could keep doing her work, and in that quietness there was a respect that moved her more deeply than any words could have. She stood there for a long while, looking up at the healed roof. Then she drew a breath, tied back her hair, and began the next thing, because outside someone was already waiting at the door, and a woman with hands that knew how to heal always had another next thing to do. Tobias was an 18-year-old boy with bright eyes and a restless curiosity, one of the youngest faces around the harbor, and he had become a familiar presence in Maeve's warehouse, often stopping by to help her arrange supplies or simply to talk while she worked. He made a living doing deliveries, pedaling his old bicycle through the streets with packages tied behind the seat. But Maeve soon noticed something in him larger than that work, a sharp curiosity and a notebook he always carried with him, filling it with all kinds of things in messy handwriting. One afternoon he confessed to her with the awkward pride of a young person doing something he believed, mattered that he was helping Ferris Kwan, the owner of the neighborhood's small independent paper, gathering news, writing down what people said around the harbor, looking publicly into the land sales everyone whispered about but no one wrote down. Mr. Kwan says the truth needs someone willing to go pick it up, Tobias told her, his eyes shining. "And I run fast. I hear a lot of things. I want to be a journalist, Miss Maeve. I want to write things that make people unable to pretend they don't see anymore." Maeve listened to him and felt warmth rise in her chest, because in his eagerness there was something pure that the world had not yet managed to harden, and she quietly hoped it would remain with him for a very long time. But the afternoon that changed everything came on a day when the wind shifted, when the air grew heavy and damp, the kind of weather Maeve knew was an enemy to weak lungs. Tobias was helping her move a few boxes when she heard it, one wheezing breath, then another, the sound of air struggling to force itself through airways closing down. She spun around and saw him frozen where he stood, one hand gripping the edge of the table, his chest rising and falling in frantic jerks, and on his face was the raw terror of someone who could not breathe. "I can't get air," he managed to say, and his lips had already begun to turn pale. Maeve recognized it at once as an acute asthma attack, and in that instant, the instant she saw a young life fighting for every breath, time folded in on itself, and she was no longer in the warehouse, but back in the emergency room from years before, back with the patient she had not saved, back with the hands that had trembled at the very second they had needed to be steady most. That fear reared up, ready to swallow her whole. But then something else inside her spoke, deeper than fear, the part forged through 1,000 shifts, and she heard her own voice come out calm and certain. "Tobias, look at me. Look into my eyes. Do you have an inhaler? In your pocket, in your backpack. Search quickly." He shook his head in panic, and Maeve forced herself to think fast, her hands already acting before thought could catch up, guiding him down onto a chair, positioning him slightly bent forward, shoulders loose, the posture that opened the chest as much as possible. "Don't try to drag in a hard breath. Breathe out slowly, slowly, with me. I'm here. You're not alone." She held his gaze, using her own calm as an anchor for him to hold on to in the middle of panic. And she remembered that in her small medicine box, there was a bronchodilator inhaler she had managed to get from a sympathetic pharmacy, and she reached for it, showed him how to use it correctly, counted each breath with him in an even voice like a lullaby. And then, slowly, miraculously, she heard the wheezing begin to ease, his chest beginning to expand, air beginning to find a way in, and the pale color on his lips faded as pink returned. Tobias drew one long breath, then another, deep and whole, and he looked up at her with eyes still wet but bright again, and a trembling smile broke across his face, the smile of someone who had just come back from the edge. "I can breathe," he whispered, almost unable to believe it. "You did it." And Maeve, kneeling on the dusty warehouse floor beside the boy whose breathing had become steady again, felt something break open inside her chest, not pain but release, because this time she had not failed. This time her trembling hands had held steady. This time she had taken back a life from the thing that had stolen everything from her. Tears rose into her eyes, and she did not bother to stop them, and she understood that she was not only crying for Tobias. She was crying for the woman in Cleveland she had not been able to save, and for herself, for the part of herself she had believed had died along with her honor. In that moment, kneeling beneath the warm yellow light with the sound of a young man's breath growing steady again beside her, Maeve Sullivan began, for the first time in a very long while, to forgive herself. That night, after Tobias had gotten home safely, and the warehouse had sunk into silence, Maeve sat alone beneath the yellow light, and allowed the memory she had locked away for all these months to finally return, because she understood that she could never truly heal if she kept running from it. The old woman's name was Eleanor Pratt, and she had been 74 years old on the night she was brought into the emergency room of the Cleveland hospital, where Maeve worked, a small woman with silver hair and eyes that were still sharp, even though her body had begun to fail, and she arrived with symptoms that set off the warning bells in Maeve's instincts from the very first moment. Something was wrong. Something did not fit the diagnosis the doctor on duty that night had made in haste, and Maeve, with her sharp memory for medications, and the intuition honed through years of work, spoke up. She said Mrs. Pratt's symptoms looked more like a drug reaction than the condition they were about to treat, that there was something suspicious about the medicine she had taken before coming to the hospital, that they should run the tests again before putting anything else into her body. But she was only a nurse, and the voice of a nurse in that rigid hospital order was as weightless as breath, and they brushed her aside. She stayed with Mrs. Pratt all night, holding the old woman's thin hand, doing everything she was allowed to do, fighting to keep her there with everything she had. But her hands were bound by orders she was not permitted to challenge, and by the time the truth finally emerged, it was too late. And Eleanor Pratt died just before dawn, her hand still lying in Maeve's. And that should have been only a tragedy, one of the painful tragedies that still happened in the profession, if not for what came afterward. Because when people began looking for what had gone wrong, when questions about that suspicious medication began to be asked, someone needed a person to blame, someone small enough and vulnerable enough to carry the guilt without being able to fight back. And that person was Maeve. The records were altered, her notes disappeared, and other notes appeared in their place. And suddenly she, the woman who had warned them about that medicine, became the one accused of negligence, of giving the wrong treatment, of causing the very death she had tried, with all her strength, to prevent. She stood before the disciplinary board and told the truth, told it again and again. But what weight did the truth of one solitary nurse have against papers that had been carefully arranged? And the deepest wound, the one that still had not healed, was Delaney Voss. The man she was supposed to marry, the ambitious resident physician she had loved and trusted, the man who had promised he would always stand beside her. When the case broke open, when her name began to be stained, she went to him, needing him to testify, needing him to say that he knew who she was, that he knew what she had warned them about. And he looked at her with that familiar, gentle disappointment, the look he always used to make her feel small, and he said perhaps she should accept responsibility, that fighting back would only make everything worse, that he couldn't allow his career to be dragged down with hers. He turned his back and walked away, and in that moment Maeve understood that she had never truly been loved, only possessed, and now that she no longer had any use, she had been thrown away like anything whose value had run out. They took her license, they took her honor, and with that, she lost her apartment, lost the friends who did not dare stand near someone carrying a ruined name, lost even the ability to look into a mirror without seeing Mrs. Pratt's face. She left Cleveland in silence and drifted from one city to another until both her money and her hope ran dry, and she finally ended up face down in a rainy alley in Chicago. But sitting here tonight, beneath the yellow light of the warehouse, with the memory of Tobias being saved still warm inside her chest, Maeve looked back at all of it and for the first time allowed herself to see a truth that guilt had hidden for so long. That she had not killed Mrs. Pratt, that she had done everything she could, that the woman's death had not been her fault, but the crime of those who had lied. Her hands trembled because they had taught her to believe those hands had failed. But those hands had just saved a life, and she sat there for a long time, letting the tears fall, no longer tears of shame, but tears of something beginning to heal. That night came close to midnight, when Maeve was still awake in the small room above Roz's diner, unable to sleep because the thoughts that had been stirred up inside her were still lying in disorder. And then she heard noise downstairs, hurried footsteps and voices pressed down into tense whispers, carrying the tone of crisis. She sat up at once, the old instinct waking her faster than consciousness itself, and when she reached the bottom of the stairs, she saw them, 3 men supporting a body sagging between them, and it took her a second to realize it was August. He was still conscious, but his face had turned ashen, one side of his shirt was dark and blotched, and he was pressing one hand against his ribs with the strained calm of someone trying not to show how badly he hurt. Roz was already there, and one of the men, Merrick, was saying something in a rush about an ambush, about men waiting in the dark near Pier 7, about gunshots and a car disappearing into the night. Maeve heard herself say to take him to the warehouse, and her voice had taken on that calm, authoritative tone again, the voice that had commanded so many chaotic rooms. There were more supplies there. Move quickly, but don't let him walk on his own. They looked at her, and for a moment she saw hesitation on their faces. The suspicion of men not used to handing their leader's life to a woman they did not yet understand. But August, even through the pain, gave a faint nod, and that was enough. They carried him through the night to the warehouse, and Maeve ran ahead, lit the lamp, washed her hands, laid out everything she had on the old table, and by the time they set him down, she was ready. She cut the blood-soaked shirt from his body with decisive snips of the scissors and looked at the wound, and the nurse inside her immediately assessed the situation with professional coldness, pushing every emotion aside to make room for judgment. The bullet had grazed his side, tearing a long line along his ribs but not lodging inside, and that was the only mercy in this whole thing. Because it meant she did not have to do what she could not do, did not need an operating room and all the things she did not have. But he was losing blood, too much of it, and from the way his skin had gone pale and sweat had gathered across his forehead, she could tell his body was beginning to slide into shock. She worked quickly and precisely, pressing hard to stop the bleeding, raising his legs to help blood reach the vital organs, covering him with the blanket Roz had just brought to keep him warm, measuring his pulse with 2 fingers against his neck and counting silently, ordering the men standing uselessly around them to get water, bring more light, keep him awake by talking to him. August, look at me. Stay with me. Can you hear me? His eyes opened halfway, found her face, and he tried to give her a crooked smile through the pain. He rasped that she was ordering him around again. That's right, she answered, and there was trembling relief in her voice when she heard he still had enough strength to joke. And you're going to listen. Don't talk anymore. Save your strength. Once the blood was under control and she had cleaned the wound, she knew what came next. She knew the long tear in his flesh needed stitches, or he would keep losing blood and the threat of infection would put his life in danger. And in her supply box, there were sterile needles and suture thread she had saved for emergencies. The kind of emergencies she had quietly prayed would never come. She picked up the needle. And right then, at the very moment when she needed her hands to be steadiest, she felt them begin to tremble. Not the slight trembling she had learned to suppress with smaller wounds, but a deep tremor from the bones, the tremor of that night in Cleveland, the tremor of the curse guilt had planted in her hands. Because this time was different. This was not a cut hand or an asthma attack. This time a life was truly hanging beneath her hands, a man who could die if she did the wrong thing, and the memory of another life that had slipped from her grasp rose black as a wave. She looked at the needle shaking in her fingers, looked at August lying there and trusting her with his life, and she understood that this moment was the line, that everything she had tried to rebuild over the past weeks would be decided here, in whether she could make her hand stop shaking or not. Maeve looked at the needle trembling in her hand, and then she did the only thing she knew how to do when everything was falling apart. She drew a deep breath and told herself the thing that had kept her alive through all those months, that she did not have to save an entire life all at once. She only had to do the next thing, and the next thing was 1 stitch, just 1 stitch. She could do 1 stitch. She closed her eyes for 1 second, and in the darkness behind her lids, she did not see Mrs. Pratt's face the way she had feared she would, but Tobias's trembling smile when he could breathe again, the warehouse roof quietly repaired, all the small pieces of proof that her hands still knew how to heal, and when she opened her eyes, the trembling had eased, not vanished entirely, but become small enough for her to master, and she drove the first needle through his flesh with a precision that came from somewhere deeper than fear. She stitched 1 suture at a time, steady and careful, closing the long wound with the neat thread of someone who knew that a clean stitch was one that would heal without infection. And she worked in absolute concentration, the whole world narrowing, until there was only the tip of the needle and skin, and the breathing of the man beneath her hands. When the final stitch was tied and she cleaned the wound and covered it with bandages, August had slipped into a state half-conscious and half-delirious, his body finally surrendering after the immediate danger had passed, and she sat down on the chair beside him to keep watch, checking his pulse regularly, following every sign, because she knew the hours ahead were when vigilance mattered most, and it was in those quiet hours, while the yellow light fell across August's face as he drifted in a mild fever, that she heard him begin to speak. The words were broken, scattered, the fever language of a man floating between 2 shores of awareness, and most of it she could not make out until one name rose out of the blurred sounds, clear and painful enough to make her go still. Nell, he whispered, and his voice broke around that name in a way she had never heard from this man who always held every feeling in check. Nell, I'm sorry. I wasn't in time. I wasn't in time to buy you the right medicine. His hand, the hand that had lifted her from the rainwater, groped through the air as if searching for someone, and Maeve, without time to think, took it. His fingers closed around hers with the surprising strength of a man lost in delirium, and he pulled her hand closer as if afraid it would disappear, and he whispered that name again. "Nell, don't go. Stay with me." This time, stay with me, and Maeve understood. In that moment she understood everything. The small woman's watch on his wrist, the code he had paid such a high price to keep, why a man who ruled an entire underworld would stop his car in the rain for a strange woman lying in an alley. He had once lost someone. He had once stood helpless while a life he loved slipped away because of a pill, and he had carried that loss for years like a watch on his wrist that he never took off. Tears rose in Maeve's eyes, and she did not stop them, because she realized that the two of them carried the same kind of wound, only it had come from opposite sides of the same tragedy. He was the one who had lost, and she was the one who had failed to save, and both of them had worn that guilt like a chain around the throat through their lonely years. She bent close to him, tightening her hand around his, and whispered beside his ear, not as a nurse soothing a patient, but as one human being speaking to another through the wall of pain. "I'm here," she said softly, her voice catching. "Can you hear me, August? This time I won't let you go, I promise. I'm not letting you go anywhere." And though she did not know whether he could hear her, whether those words could reach him inside his fever, she felt his hand slowly soften in hers, the restless searching settle, his breathing deepen and grow steadier, as though somewhere beneath the fever, some part of him had finally heard that this time someone had stayed. And Maeve sat there all night, hand in hand with the man she had just taken back from death, and between them, in the quiet warehouse under the yellow light, two old wounds finally touched. August recovered slowly over the weeks that followed, because a wound like that did not heal in a few days, and he stayed in the warehouse under Maeve's care far longer than a proud man like him wanted to admit he needed. She changed his bandages every day, watched the stitches close little by little, forced him to rest when his instinct was to stand up and return to his work, and in those long, quiet days, something between them changed, shifting from the relationship between rescuer and rescued into something else, more fragile and harder to name. He did not mention the night of his delirium, and neither did she, but both of them knew it had happened, knew that the name Nell had been spoken between them and could not be taken back. And it lay there between them, like a door left slightly open that neither of them had yet stepped through. Then, late one afternoon, when the last sunlight of the day slanted through the dusty warehouse window and turned the whole space gold, August opened that door himself. He was sitting propped against the stack of pillows. Maeve had arranged behind his back, turning the small woman's watch on his wrist with his thumb, the unconscious motion she had noticed him make whenever his mind drifted somewhere far away, and he began speaking without looking at her, as though it would be easier not to look into someone's eyes while saying this aloud. He said his sister's name was Nell, his voice low and even, the calmness of someone who had rehearsed this story in his mind thousands of times, even though he had never spoken it aloud to anyone. She was 6 years younger than him. After their parents died, there were only the two of them left. He raised her. He was 16, she was 10, and he did whatever he had to do so they could survive, including things a 16-year-old boy should never have had to do. He stopped, and Maeve sat silently, not rushing him, only leaving the quiet there for him, because she understood that some stories could only be told at their own pace. Nell was sick, he went on, an illness that needed regular medicine to control. The medicine was expensive, and they had no insurance, nothing at all. So when he earned his first large enough amount of money from the work he had just begun to enter, the world he now stood at the head of, the first thing he did was buy medicine for her. He had been so proud. For the first time in his life, he felt as if he could take care of her. His fingers tightened around the watch, but the medicine he bought was not real, Maeve. He bought it cheaper from a source that was not clear because he was still short on money, and he did not know, he swore he did not know, that it was counterfeit. The packaging looked exactly the same, but inside there was nothing, or worse than nothing, and she kept taking it regularly, believing it was helping her, while in truth her illness only kept getting worse. His voice broke there, just slightly, the first crack in the shell of calm. He had sat beside her bed when she went. He held her hand, just like he stopped, and Maeve knew he was thinking of the night he had held hers, just like the way people held someone's hand when they could do nothing else. And the last thing he thought, when she drew her final breath, was that he had killed her. With the very money he thought would save her. With his own pride, Maeve felt tears sting the corners of her eyes, and she reached out and placed her hand over his, the hand that was gripping the watch, and this time she said nothing, because she understood that there were kinds of pain that comfort only made smaller in an insulting way. "This watch was Nell's," he said softly, finally looking into her eyes. It was the only thing he kept of hers. He wore it so he would never forget, and he built the rule everyone in this neighborhood knew, that no strong person was allowed to hurt the weak on his ground, because this whole world was built on the backs of people like Nell, people too poor, too small, too invisible to protect themselves. Halloran and men like him made money from exactly that. From counterfeit medicine, from desperate people, poor enough to buy anything cheaper. He could not save Nell. But he could stand between men like Halloran and the people who were left. That was the only thing that gave meaning to what he did. And Maeve looked at this man, the man the whole harbor feared the way people feared the sound of a door locking behind them, and she saw the truth beneath that shell, saw a 16-year-old boy sitting beside his sister's bed, with his first money turned into a blade, and she understood that he had not saved her from the rainy alley out of simple kindness, but because in her he had seen another Nell, a weak person thrown to the ground by the world, and he had sworn to himself that this time he would not stand by and watch. When August was strong enough to stand and return to his world, he invited Maeve to come with him one evening. He did not explain why, only said there was something he needed to deal with, and he wanted her to understand more clearly who he truly was before she decided how close to him she wanted to stand. She hesitated, because the watchful part of her, the part Delaney and the whole world had taught to know that men often showed you their best before revealing their worst, had not fallen completely silent. But she went, because she realized she wanted to know, wanted to see the whole of him, and not only the gentle part that had told her about Nell in the afternoon light, and because she had learned that trusting someone blindly and refusing to trust someone blindly were both forms of cowardice in their own way. He took her to another warehouse on the far side of the harbor, larger and darker, and there several of his men were standing around a man seated in a chair, a man Maeve vaguely recognized as someone who had lingered around Roz's diner a few times, a low-level errand man named Dooley. The air in the room was stretched tight as wire, and Maeve understood at once that this was no ordinary meeting, that Dooley had done something, and now it was time to pay for it. August stepped inside, and the whole room seemed to shift around his presence, the quiet power radiating from him in a way Maeve had never seen fully until this moment. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He only pulled out a chair and sat across from Dooley, looked at him with eyes so calm they were chilling, and allowed the silence to stretch, that particular silence of his, until Dooley began to sweat and stammer. August said that Dooley had told Halloran's men he would be at Pier 7 that night, that he had done it for money, that August knew how much, and knew exactly who he had met. Dooley began to deny it, but August only lifted one hand slightly, and the man fell silent. He told him not to make everything worse by lying, that he had not brought him here to kill him, that he did not kill people over money, even when that money had nearly taken his life, that this was his line, and he did not cross it, not even for Dooley. And what August did next made Maeve, watching from the darkness, rethink everything she thought she knew about men like him. He did not use violence. He took from Dooley something even more valuable in this world. He declared that from tonight on, Dooley was no longer protected, no longer belonged to this neighborhood, that his name would be passed around so everyone would know what he had done, and that he had 24 hours to leave Chicago, before August stopped controlling the people he had betrayed. It was punishment by rules rather than blood, exile instead of death, and it was cruel in such a civilized way that Maeve shivered, because she understood that in a place like this, being stripped of belonging could sometimes weigh more heavily than being stripped of life. But just as Dooley was being pulled to his feet to be taken away, he did something desperate. He twisted back to look at August and blurted out his words like a final gamble. "You think I'm the only one selling information to him?" Dooley gave a harsh laugh, the laugh of a man who had lost everything and had nothing left to protect. "I'm nothing. There's someone much closer to you doing things 100 times worse than anything I ever did. Halloran knows everything you do, August, everything, and not from people like me. Keep trusting someone close to you and see what happens." The room suddenly went silent, and Maeve saw something pass across August's face. Not fear, because he was not the kind of man who knew how to fear, but a new caution. The look of someone who had just heard a strange sound inside a house he thought was safe. He did not answer duly, only gave a slight nod for his men to take him away. But Maeve knew those words had lodged in him like a splinter. And on the drive back through the silence, she looked at the man beside her, the man who had just shown her how cold and absolute he could be, and she wondered where she stood in this world where kindness and power were woven together until they could no longer be separated, and whether a woman who only wanted to heal could ever truly belong inside it. In the weeks that followed, as life gradually returned to its ordinary rhythm, and August quietly kept watch over Dooley's warning in his own way, Maeve continued her work in the warehouse, and it was there, among the people who came to her to be healed, that the nurse inside her, the part that had been awakened and was now coming back to life more powerfully than ever, began to notice something no one else would have noticed. It began with a vague feeling, the professional instinct she had learned long ago to trust, the sense that something did not fit. Because she kept seeing the same thing again and again. The older woman who lived in the camper came in with persistent headaches and trembling hands. A dock worker complained of endless fatigue and nausea every morning. Another man had strange skin rashes and a memory that kept flickering in and out. The wife of the boat repair shop owner had dizzy spells she blamed on age. One by one, taken separately, none of it seemed alarming. Every symptom could be explained by 100 ordinary reasons, by poverty, by old age, by heavy labor, by the harshness of harbor life. But Maeve did not look at them separately. She looked at all of them at once, and the mind that had once read medical charts and joined symptoms into diagnoses began to work, threading scattered fragments into a picture, and that picture sent a chill down her spine, because all these symptoms, when placed beside one another, headaches, tremors, nausea, rashes, memory loss, chronic fatigue, were not random separate illnesses. They were a pattern. They were signs of poisoning, of long-term exposure to some kind of chemical, something seeping slowly into human bodies over time, and wearing them down from the inside so gradually that no one noticed until it was too late. She sat in the warehouse that night beneath the yellow light and did something she had not done for all those months. She took paper and a pen and began making systematic notes, creating a list, each person's name, their symptoms, where they lived, where they worked, where they got their water, what they ate. She worked like an epidemiological investigator, searching for the common point, the denominator all these people shared, because she knew that mass poisoning like this always had a source, an origin from which the poison spread. And when she marked on a rough hand-drawn map where each patient lived, that denominator appeared so clearly it took her breath away. All of them lived or worked in the same area, the strip of land around the old warehouses on the eastern side of the harbor, and all of them drew water from the same aging pipes running underground through that area. Water. The common denominator was water. Something was getting into the water supply in that district, silently poisoning people too poor to leave, and too invisible for anyone to bother investigating why they were growing weaker. And as soon as that thought formed, another followed immediately, sharp and heavy, because she remembered everything she had heard about Halloran, about the way he made people tired before making them bankrupt, about the cheap land purchases, about the eastern strip he wanted to seize. If an area became known as contaminated, if the people there kept growing sick and desperate, the land value would collapse, and people would sell for almost nothing just to escape a place that was making them ill without understanding why. Maeve sat motionless for a long time with the map in front of her, and she understood that she had accidentally touched something far larger than the wounds she had been bandaging. Something that, if she was right, was not an accident but a crime. The next morning, before sunrise, she brought several clean glass jars she had washed carefully, and she quietly went to the public taps and exposed pipes in the eastern district, filling each jar with water, labeling everyone carefully with location, date, and time. The precision of someone trained to know that evidence only had value when it was collected properly. She did not yet know exactly what she would do next with those water samples, did not yet know how to test them, how to prove what she suspected. But she knew one thing, that these sick people deserved someone to search for the truth for them, and that this time, no one would be able to make her hands stop. Maeve knew suspicion was not evidence, and that a hand-drawn map and a few jars of water would not be enough to confront a force like Halloran, so she did the only reasonable thing. She went to the only person in the neighborhood who had the tools to dig into a truth that had been buried. Ferris Kwan was a man around 40, with tired eyes behind his glasses and fingers always stained with printer's ink. The owner of the small independent newspaper Tobias had been helping with, and when Maeve spread her map and her list of patients across the paper-crowded desk in his cramped office, he looked at it in silence for a very long time, and when he lifted his eyes, the weariness in them had been replaced by something else, the light of a journalist who had just caught the scent of a major story. "You know what you're saying, don't you?" he said, not quite as a question. "I know what I'm seeing," Maeve answered, "and I'm seeing an entire neighborhood being slowly poisoned. I just don't know why or how yet." Ferris stood, went to an old filing cabinet in the corner of the room, and rummaged through it for a while before pulling out a yellowed folder. "I've been chasing Halloran for years," he said, "but he's slippery as an eel. Everything is legal on paper. There is one thing, though, that I've never been able to understand." He set the file down and opened an old diagram. The large warehouse on the eastern side, the abandoned one now, used to belong to a small chemical company Halloran bought a long time ago. That company shut down, but there has never been any record of cleanup or disposal of whatever was left inside. And in that moment, when Maeve looked at the location of the old chemical warehouse on Ferris's diagram and compared it with her own map of patients, every piece fell into place with a chilling fit. That warehouse sat directly upstream of the old water pipe system running through the Eastern District. For years, something inside that abandoned warehouse, forgotten barrels of chemicals, waste that had never been properly handled, had been silently leaking into the ground and seeping into the water supply, poisoning every person who lived nearby with every sip they drank. And Halloran knew. He had to know because that warehouse belonged to him, and instead of spending money to fix the leak, a costly act that would expose his responsibility, he had chosen silence, letting it continue, even turning it into a tool. Because a neighborhood where people kept growing sick and desperate was a neighborhood that would sell for almost nothing, and all he had to do was stand there, patient as he always was, buying up each parcel of land as those sick people finally gave up and left. This was not merely covering up an accident. It was turning the suffering of invisible people into profit. Maeve felt a cold anger rise in her chest, the kind of anger with purpose rather than sudden emotion, and she and Ferris began working that very night, building a complete file, matching the patient list to the pipe diagram, recording each person's account, preparing to send the water samples for testing at an independent laboratory Ferris knew outside the city. She brought the jars of water and copies of the file back to her warehouse, placing them in a hidden compartment behind the medical shelving. But as she did, Dooley's final warning about a traitor close to home suddenly rang in her head like a death bell. Her instincts, honed by years of watching people hide secrets, told her that no place here was truly safe anymore. Acting fast, she decided to turn this hiding spot into a trap. That very night, she secretly gave the real water samples and the primary file to Tobias, instructing him to deliver them straight to Mr. Ferris Kwan, leaving only decoys behind in the warehouse. The next morning, when Maeve arrived early and saw that things had been subtly moved, her heart didn't clench in shock, but in grim confirmation. She checked the compartment and found it empty. The bait had been taken. Standing there in the quiet warehouse, a cold certainty settled over her. The thief knew exactly where to look. It wasn't a random search by Halloran's men. The traitor was indeed inside their inner circle, exactly as she had suspected, and the chess game had officially begun. Maeve went to August that very afternoon, and she told him everything. About the chain of symptoms, about the water supply, about Halloran's chemical warehouse, and finally about the evidence that had been stolen by a hand that knew far too well where it was hidden. He listened with his familiar flat expression, but she had learned to read him well enough to see what was moving beneath it. Anger held carefully in check, and something else too, a connection being made inside his mind. Because while Maeve had been investigating the water, August had been investigating in his own way, following the trail of the ambush that night, tracing it back from the men who had fired the shots to the person who had paid them, and every road led to the same place, to Halloran. "I knew it was him," August said, his voice low, "but I needed to know why he would take the risk this time of having people shoot me." Halloran doesn't do anything without calculation. Shooting at me was a dangerous move, which means I'm standing in the way of something much larger than a few pieces of land. And when Maeve said the words counterfeit medicine, when she told him that the chemical warehouse was only one part of it, that Halloran ran a much wider network, a pharmaceutical conglomerate distributing medicines everywhere, she saw something change on his face, a sudden and frightening stillness, like water going calm before a storm. Say that again, he said quietly. His pharmaceutical network. Tell me what you know. And so the two of them, sitting across from each other in the fading afternoon light, began joining together the pieces of two lives that seemed to have nothing to do with each other, and the picture that appeared left them both silent. Because Ferris, while digging deeper into Halloran's corporation, had traced one of the business branches he controlled to a cheap pharmaceutical distribution network. Medicines made carelessly or counterfeited and pushed into the market through unofficial channels, shadowy pharmacies, suppliers for the poor, exactly the kind of source a desperate 16-year-old boy had once turned to when he needed medicine for his little sister. And that same network, that same stream of lying pills, was also the thing that had brought into the hospital in Cleveland the suspicious medicine Eleanor Pratt had taken before being admitted. The medicine Maeve had warned them about. The medicine that had cost her everything when someone needed a scapegoat to hide the true source of that death. August sat motionless for a long time after he understood. Nell's watch silent on his wrist, and when he finally spoke, his voice was choked in a way Maeve had never heard before. The pill that killed my sister, he said slowly, and the pill that ruined your life. They came from the same source. From the same man. Maeve felt the whole world tilt beneath her feet, because through all those months she had believed her tragedy was a private injustice, a random disaster that had chosen her by mistake. And now she realized it had never been random, that she and this man, two people thrown by fate into the same rainy alley, had in truth been destroyed by the same hand long before they ever met. Not because of some strange blood connection, not because of some mystical design, but because of a truth far simpler and far crueler, that the greed of a man like Halloran spread outward like poison, seeping into countless lives he had never even seen, killing one person's little sister and staining another person's honor, all for the same motive. Money. He doesn't know us, Maeve whispered, almost to herself. He doesn't even know we exist. We're just numbers in his books, collateral damage, but now he will know, August said, and when he lifted his eyes to her, they burned with a light she had never seen before. Not hot, reckless rage, but a resolve as cold and deep as the bottom of the sea. For years I've stood between men like him and the weak, without knowing he was the one who took Nell from me. And you lost everything because you tried to speak the truth about him. We carry the same wound, Maeve, and now we know who caused it. She looked at him, and in that moment, in the middle of the pain of this discovery, she felt something else taking shape too. Not despair, but strength, because for the first time in her life, she did not have to face the person who had destroyed her alone. And the man sitting before her was not only an ally, but the only person in the world who understood exactly the wound she carried, because he carried that same wound too. He came on a gray afternoon, when Maeve was alone in the warehouse rearranging the few supplies left after the theft. And she knew someone had stepped inside by the sound of his shoes, the sound of expensive leather tapping against concrete, a sound she had thought she would never have to hear again. She turned, and there, standing in the warehouse doorway with the misplaced elegance of a luxury object set down in the wrong place, was Delaney Voss. He had not changed. That was the first thing she thought, that time had passed, that an entire life had collapsed and been rebuilt. And yet he looked exactly as he had in her memory, wearing a perfectly pressed suit, his hair groomed without a single strand out of place. He carried that smooth, empty beauty of a magazine cover, and above all, still wore that smile, the smile filled with carefully measured, gentle disappointment, the weapon he had used for years to make her feel small. Maeve, he said, and the way he spoke her name, tender and regretful, awakened in her a whole current of memories she had tried to bury. My God, look at you. I've been looking for you everywhere. You haven't been looking for anyone, she answered, and she was surprised by how steady her voice was. You've never looked for anything that didn't benefit you. So what do you want, Delaney? He stepped into the warehouse, his eyes moving around the shabby space with its old shelves and yellow lamp, and on his face appeared the exact expression she knew far too well, the look of someone judging a thing and finding it beneath him, the look he had once used on her whenever she did something that displeased him. "This is how you're living?" he said, his voice full of staged concern. "A gifted nurse like you, bandaging homeless people in a run-down warehouse. You deserve more than this, Maeve. You always deserved more than this, but you keep insisting on doing everything the hardest way." And there, in that single sentence, Maeve realized something that almost made her laugh from the relief of it, that the words that had once had the power to destroy her now fell without leaving even a scratch, because she was no longer the woman who believed her worth depended on his eyes. "Get to the point," she said. Delaney sighed, that familiar sigh, and took an envelope from inside his coat and placed it on her examination table. "I can restore everything for you," he said. "I have connections now, connections that can make your record clean again, get your license reinstated, make the whole Cleveland situation disappear as though it never happened. You can come back. A real hospital, a real life, not this." He tilted his chin toward the warehouse with undisguised contempt. "I can give you back everything you lost." Maeve looked at the envelope on the table, then at him, and she understood at once that this was not an apology, but a transaction, and like every transaction, it had a price hidden inside it. "In exchange for what?" she asked. His smile wavered, only for a moment, just long enough for her to see the real animal underneath. "In exchange for you stopping this dangerous game you're playing," he said, and his voice had lost its sweet coating, revealing the hardcore beneath. "I know what you're doing, Maeve. I know about the water samples, about the questions you're asking, about that newspaper man you're working with. You think you can poke at things much bigger than you and no one will notice?" And in that moment, everything became chillingly clear. Delaney had not come to her on his own. He had been sent. He was now part of that network, a pawn of Halloran's, and the connections he boasted of were the very strings binding him to the same machine that had destroyed her. "You work for him," she said, and it was not a question. "You work for Halloran. I work for people who can give me what I want," Delaney answered coldly. "And I'm offering to share that with you one last time, because of what we used to have. Take it, Maeve. Go back to your old life and forget this place. Because if you don't take it, if you insist on digging, I'm not sure I can protect you from what happens next. And this time it won't only be your license." The threat hung in the air between them, soft and polite and cruel, exactly in his style, and Maeve stood straight, looking directly into the eyes of the man who had once made her believe she was nothing without him. And what she felt inside was not fear but a steel calm, because she had already risen from the bottom of the abyss, and a person who had touched the bottom had nothing left to lose to fear. When Maeve did not take the envelope, when she stood there with steel calm instead of the submission he had expected, Delaney moved to another option, and that option was far more subtle and cowardly than an empty threat. A few days later he returned to the warehouse, but this time he did not come alone. With him was a middle-aged man in a white coat, carrying the respectable appearance of a doctor, a man Delaney introduced as Dr. Whitmore, a psychiatrist, and Maeve knew at once that something was deeply wrong from the way the two men entered, the way they carried a thick file and the cold confidence of people who had already arranged everything. "Maeve," Delaney said in his most falsely gentle voice, "I'm worried about you. We're all worried about you. Look at how you're living, at the things you're imagining about conspiracies and poison in the water. Dr. Whitmore here has reviewed your condition, and he agrees with me that you need help, that you're no longer in a state where you can care for yourself or make reliable judgments." And he opened the file, and Maeve saw it, an elaborately fabricated medical record bearing Dr. Whitmore's signature, describing her as a woman suffering from paranoia, obsession, and detachment from reality, a woman who believed in non-existent conspiracies and needed to be placed under mandatory medical supervision. She understood at once how dangerous this attack was, because if she was labeled incompetent, delusional, paranoid, then everything she said about Halloran, about the water supply, about the counterfeit medicine network, would become the ramblings of a sick mind, and her testimony would lose all value. This was how they would silence her without spilling a drop of blood, by turning the very truth she was trying to expose into evidence of her madness. Delaney stepped closer, and he reached out to take her wrist, the gesture both soothing and controlling, the touch she remembered far too clearly from the old years, and his voice lowered. Come with us, Maeve. Don't make this difficult. Everything will be easier if you cooperate. But Maeve was no longer the woman from those old years. She pulled her hand out of his grasp and stepped back, placing the old examination table between herself and the two men like a trench, and when she spoke, her voice did not tremble. It was cold and clear, the voice of a nurse who had read thousands of files and knew exactly what an honest record looked like. "Show me that file," she said, and before they could react, she reached for it, flipping through the pages with eyes trained to catch errors. "Dr. Whitmore, you wrote here that you examined me on the 12th. Interesting, because on the 12th I was at the laboratory with Mr. Ferris Kwan all day, with witnesses. You've never met me. This is the first time." She turned another page. "And here, you listed a sedative dose in my history that I've never taken, at a strength anyone in their first year of medical school would know is wrong. A dose like that would kill a person, not treat them. You didn't even bother to look it up properly." Her voice grew steadier with every sentence, each one like a precise cut from a scalpel. "The evaluation signature on the final page is dated before the day you claim to have examined me. You signed the conclusion before meeting the patient. This whole file is a clumsy forgery, and any medical board would see it within 30 seconds. And right then, something Delaney had not anticipated happened, because Maeve had already prepared for this move. She had arranged for a female nurse from a nearby community clinic, an honest woman she knew through her work, to stop by the warehouse at that exact time to pick up some medical supplies, and that woman had been standing in the doorway for the past several minutes, witnessing everything, hearing every word Maeve used to expose them. "You heard all of that, didn't you, Diane?" Maeve said without taking her eyes off Delaney. The nurse nodded slowly, her face pale from what she had just understood. "I heard all of it," she answered, "and that file is absolutely unacceptable." Delaney's face changed color, the polite shell finally cracking apart, revealing underneath not confidence, but the desperation of a man clinging to the status he knew he was about to lose. And Maeve looked at him with cold clarity, understanding that he was dangerous not because he was strong, but because he was losing his footing, and a man losing his footing would do anything. The moment the fake file was exposed in front of a witness, Maeve knew Delaney's game had fallen apart, but she also understood that a desperate man cornered against a wall was far more frightening than a confident one, and she saw it in his eyes, the look of someone who had just realized his plan had collapsed and was calculating what he could still do. Dr. Whitmore had quietly gathered up the file and backed toward the door, the instinct of an accomplice wanting to separate himself from a sinking ship. But Delaney did not retreat. He stood there, both hands clenched, and Maeve realized the air in the warehouse had changed, had become dangerous in a way words could no longer control. And in that moment, she did something the Maeve of months before would never have done. She took out her phone and called August. She paused for 1 second before pressing the button, and in that second she understood the true meaning of what she was doing. Her whole life, she had believed that getting up alone was strength, that needing someone was weakness, that leaning on another person was how people began to break. And that belief had been forged through the years when Delaney and the world itself taught her that no one could be trusted. But she had learned something else in these months at the harbor, something she only truly understood in this moment, that there was a deep difference between needing no one because we do not dare to trust, and choosing to need someone because we have become strong enough to trust. She called August not because she could not handle things herself. She had just overturned an entire scheme with her own intelligence. She called him because she chose not to face this alone, and that choice, the right to choose whom to trust, was the very freedom she had paid so dearly to reclaim. He arrived faster than she expected, as if he had been somewhere nearby, and when the warehouse door opened, August stepped inside in the way he always entered any space, pausing for one beat at the threshold to read the room before moving into the center of it. He looked at Delaney, at Dr. Whitmore shrinking by the door, at the fake file on the table, at Maeve standing upright behind her wooden trench, and he read the entire story in only a few seconds without needing a word of explanation. He said nothing. That was what made the moment so frightening. He only stood there, still and absolute, letting his silence spread through the room like ice. The silence Maeve had learned was his most dangerous weapon, the thing that made people hear the sound of their own lies and guilt echoing inside their heads. Delaney, who had never met August, tried to salvage the last scrap of authority he had. He said this was private, but his voice had lost its firmness, that it had nothing to do with August. August looked at him for a long time, then finally spoke, and his voice was so gentle it was colder than any shouting could have been. "This woman is in my district," he said. "Everything involving her involves me. You have 30 seconds to take that fake file and disappear from this harbor, and if I see your face again, there won't be another polite conversation like this." Delaney, looking into those eyes, understood that he was facing a kind of power his paper connections could not buy, and he did the only thing a coward knew how to do. He gathered up the file and withdrew, dragging Dr. Whitmore with him, the two of them vanishing into the evening light. But before leaving, Delaney threw back one sentence, a sentence even he did not realize had revealed something. "You think you control this harbor, Reeves?" he sneered. "Halloran knows every move you make. You have a leak right inside your own house, and the person is so close to you that you'd never suspect him." The sentence remained hanging in the air after he was gone, and Maeve saw August go still, saw cold calculation move through his eyes, and she remembered Dooley's warning, remembered the evidence stolen by someone who had known exactly where it was hidden. And in that moment, one name began to form in both their minds, a name neither of them wanted to think about, the name of the man who had been at August's side the longest, closest of all, the man he trusted more than anyone else, Silas. The message arrived the next morning, neat and cold like the man who had sent it, a meeting at Pier 7 at dusk, and the unspoken message inside it was clear enough that it did not need to be said aloud, that Halloran wanted to end this, wanted Maeve to bring everything she had in exchange for the safety of the people she had tried to protect. August did not want her to go, but Maeve looked at him with a calm that forced him into silence, because she understood what he had not yet understood, that this fight was hers as much as his, that she was no longer the woman lying in an alley needing to be saved, but the only person holding the key to the whole truth. Pier 7 at dusk was a desolate place of rusted containers and black water, and when Maeve arrived, Halloran was already waiting there, a man past 50, with the polished and harmless appearance of a successful businessman, the kind of appearance that made it difficult to believe that underneath it was the man who had poisoned an entire neighborhood and killed countless people through lying pills. Beside him stood Delaney, and several men were scattered through the shadows. "Miss Sullivan," Halloran said, his voice mild, as though receiving a guest. "You have caused me quite a bit of trouble for someone with nothing in her hands. I admire that. But now let's end this in a civilized way. You give me everything you have, and I leave your little harbor alone." And at that moment, August stepped out of the darkness behind Maeve, and with him came several of his men, and the air immediately stretched tight as a wire about to snap. But what made Maeve hold her breath was not Halloran, but the figure who stepped out and stood beside him, an older man with a stern face whom she had seen at August's side many times, the man she knew as Silas, his longest-serving right hand. August went still, and on his face, for the first time, Maeve saw something break open, a pain deeper than anger. "Silas," he said, and that one name alone contained an entire betrayal. Silas did not avoid his eyes. "I knew you'd misunderstand this," the old man said, his voice heavy. "But I didn't do it for money, August. Halloran has something from the past in his hands, an old matter that could bury you, a blood debt from the early days that you don't even remember. I sold him information so he wouldn't use it, to keep you safe. I thought I was protecting you, and in that confession there was a tragedy that made even August fall silent, because this was not the betrayal of simple greed, but the betrayal of twisted love, of a man who had chosen the wrong way to protect someone he regarded as a son. Halloran smiled at the division he had just sown. "You see, Reeves, even your most loyal man belongs to me. I had all the evidence Miss Sullivan gathered, the water samples, the files. Everything has been destroyed for a long time now. You have nothing left, but Maeve." Standing between the two forces did not waver, and when she spoke, her voice rang out clear and composed, carrying the strength of someone who had already calculated every move. "You're right," she said. "The water samples in the warehouse were taken. But did you ever wonder why I would hide something so valuable in a place so easy to find?" She let the question hang in the air, and she saw the smile on Halloran's face begin to stiffen. "That was only bait, Mr. Halloran. The real water samples, the real file, I had Tobias deliver to Mr. Ferris Kwan weeks ago, right after I realized there was an informant. They were sent to an independent laboratory for testing. The results are back. And right now, while we're standing here, Mr. Kwan is printing the entire story, along with the test results proving that the poison in the water came from your own chemical warehouse. By tomorrow morning, the whole city will know. Silence fell over Pier 7. Heavy as lead, and Maeve saw the moment Halloran realized he had lost, not to power, but to a woman he had dismissed as a number in his books, collateral damage who had stood up and turned her own invisibility into a weapon. In the moment Halloran realized he had lost, Maeve waited for the thing she feared most, waited for violence to erupt, waited for the men in the darkness to draw something and turn Pier 7 into a battlefield. But August did not let that happen. He took one step forward, placing himself between Maeve and Halloran, and when he spoke, his voice carried the absolute calm of a man who knew he had already won and did not need his fists to prove it. "You have two choices, Halloran," he said. "You can order your men to do something stupid right now, and you'll have another murder charge piled on top of the heap the press is about to expose tomorrow morning. Or you can get into your car and leave, and spend the rest of your life fighting what's waiting for you in court. I know what kind of man you are. You're not reckless. You're calculating. And a calculating man knows when the game is over." And Maeve saw the truth of his words reflected on Halloran's face, saw the moment he weighed it, and understood that violence now would only make everything worse for him, that the only weapons he had left were money and lawyers, not bullets at an empty harbor. He looked at August for a long time, then his false gentleness returned like a mask being put back on, and he adjusted his collar. "You think a few tabloid pages and some test results can bring me down," he said, his voice still trying to hold confidence, but Maeve could hear the crack beneath it. "I have a team of lawyers who can drag this out for years." "Maybe," August answered. "But the water pipes will be investigated this week. Your warehouse will be sealed. And every person you poisoned now has a name, a face, a story in the newspaper. You can't buy all their silence anymore. That's what you never understood, Halloran. You thought those people were invisible, but once someone sees them, you can't make an entire city close its eyes again." Halloran did not answer. He only turned away, signaled to his men, and walked toward his car. And Silas, after one painful moment of hesitation, followed too, not toward Halloran, but stopping in the road, an old man trapped between old loyalty and new guilt. And August looked at him with an expression Maeve could not read, a mixture of betrayal and mercy. "Go home, Silas," August said softly. "We'll deal with our matter later, but not today." And the days that followed moved as fast as a flood. Ferris Kwan printed the entire story on the front page, the undeniable water test results, placed beside the list of people who had been sick for years. And once the story had come into the light, it could not be shoved back into darkness. The city's larger newspapers picked it up. The Environmental Protection Agency stepped in, sealed the chemical warehouse, and began investigating the pipe system. The leak was finally stopped, the water was treated, and the people in the Eastern District, for the first time in many years, drank water that was not quietly killing them. It was not a clean victory, and Maeve understood that well. Halloran was still a wealthy man with an army of lawyers, and the legal battle would stretch on, and perhaps he would never sit in prison in a way that matched his crimes, because this world rarely gave people complete justice. But he had been stopped. The machine that had crushed so many lives had been exposed and paralyzed. And for Maeve, there was something with a deeper private meaning. Because when the case was investigated, when the truth about Halloran's counterfeit medicine network slowly came to light, the real source of the medication that had killed Mrs. Pratt in Cleveland was finally mentioned in the investigation files, and with Ferris's help and the new evidence, Maeve's name began to be cleared. The medical board reopened her case. Her nursing license, the thing that had been taken from her along with her honor and her old life, was finally restored. She read that notification letter alone in the warehouse beneath the yellow light, and she did not shout with joy, did not burst into tears, only sat there for a very long time, holding the paper in hands that no longer shook, and felt a quiet peace rise inside her, the feeling of someone finally being given herself back. August came to her on the evening she received the letter clearing her name, as though he knew this was the moment she would be standing at a crossroads. And he stopped at the warehouse threshold the way he always stopped, reading the room, reading her face, before stepping inside. He knew her license had been restored. He knew that meant she could leave at any time now, could return to a real hospital, another city, a life without the harbor and without him, and he could have said the easy thing, could have congratulated her and told her she deserved better than this place. But August was not a man who said the easy thing. He was a man who said the true thing, and that was what Maeve valued most in him. "You can go anywhere now," he said, standing in the warehouse beneath the yellow light. "I know that, and I won't pretend I'm all right with it. I don't want you to leave, Maeve. Not because this neighborhood needs you, though it does, but because I need you. That's the truth, and I don't know how to say it any prettier." She looked at him, the man who had lifted her from the rainwater and had never demanded a single thing from her. And she saw him raise his hand to his wrist, removing the small woman's watch he had not taken off for so many years. Nell's watch, the only thing left of his sister, the piece of his soul he had worn as a reminder of pain and of the vow of his life. He held it in his hand for a moment, then gently fastened it around Maeve's wrist. "For all these years, I wore it so I would never forget that I failed to save someone I loved," he said, his voice turning hoarse. "But you taught me that holding on to pain isn't the only way to honor someone who's gone. Nell would want it on the wrist of someone who's still saving other people, not on the wrist of someone who only keeps grieving. I want you to keep it, and I want to build the rest of my life with you, if you'll let me." Tears ran down Maeve's cheeks, and this time they carried no pain at all, only the fullness of a person finally being seen and loved exactly as she was, and she raised her hand to touch the watch on her wrist, feeling the weight of everything it carried, and she nodded softly, because there were moments when words became unnecessary. 2 years later, the old warehouse where Maeve had once bandaged wounds beneath the yellow light had become a real community clinic, clean and bright, a place where anyone from the harbor could come without papers or money, needing only to be in pain and in need of help. Maeve ran it with hands that no longer trembled, hands that had found their steadiness again through the hundreds of people she had healed. Tobias, the boy who had once almost stopped breathing in that very room, was now studying medicine, carrying his old notebook and the dream that had grown up with him. And he still came by every week to help and to learn from the woman who had saved his life. As for August, he was doing the hardest thing a man like him could do, slowly and imperfectly. He was turning the empire he had inherited toward legal roads, step by step, closing the dark parts and opening the bright ones, not because he had become a perfect man overnight, but because for the first time in his life, he believed he deserved to live a life that did not have to hide in the shadows. It was not a fairy tale ending, and they both knew that. Halloran was still fighting in the courts. Silas had left, carrying with him the tragedy of loyalty placed in the wrong hands. The world was still full of injustices that had not been solved, but on an ordinary evening, in the small kitchen behind the clinic, Maeve and August sat together with a lamp between them, she reading patient files while he looked through his own papers, not saying much, simply being beside each other, in the warm stillness of two people who had found one another after both had believed they had lost everything. And that was exactly what Maeve had never known she longed for. Not grand moments, but the ordinary fullness of enough, the quiet happiness of a life rebuilt from ruins by her own hands. Because in the end, Maeve Sullivan's story teaches us something simple and profound, that the worth of a human being does not lie in whether they are standing at the highest peak or the lowest pit of life, not in something others can grant or take away, but in the dignity they keep even after losing everything, in the kindness they still give when they have nothing left for themselves, and in the courage to do the next thing right in front of them, day after day, until those small things build an entire new life. Human dignity is something no one can take from us unless we surrender it ourselves, and sometimes the person who pulls us up from the bottom of the abyss is the very person who also needs a hand to rise. If this story has touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like and share, so we can listen to many meaningful and compelling stories together every day. How do you feel about Maeve and August's journey? And which part of the story moved you the most? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep within your heart, because we always hope to hear your voice. May everyone watching this video always have good health, a joyful, peaceful life, and days filled with love. Goodbye, and see you again in the next stories.